All right, we're back. The information exchange. Ryan is unable to make it today, so we got Pryce and Brad and Brendan. And we have a PSA to kick things off. HTD is hiring. So we are looking to hire interoperability associates. If you are interested in EHR integration, health information exchange, data migration, referrals, if you like working with point solutions, if you like working with payers, if you like working with clearinghouses, big tech, small tech, non-tech, law firms, PE, we got it
Memes.
all.
If you like work,
If you want to work on data exchange, if you want to use information blocking practically, not use information blocking, but wield the powers of regulation strategy with these fine gentlemen and the broader HTD team, then reach out to us.
come hang.
And with that, we're going to kick things off. And it's Memorial Day. It's the government's day. We all have off. But let's talk about what the government's been doing with TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. Pryce, where are we at? What's going on? What are you excited about? Where are you less excited?
Well, so real quickly, sometimes I feel like we dive into topics and I think, oh, we should have just spent 30 seconds explaining what that is for folks who aren't hearing about the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement all the time. So this is a segment, maybe we could call it Pryce Transparency. Shout out to Nathan Von Kolditz for naming that. So TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, so it was written into the Cures Act that the ONC would find a coordinating entity to manage this nationwide federated exchange framework for clinical data. The way that it was built and sort of the framework itself is that there are various QHINs, qualified health information networks, like Know2 and SureScripts, and then Epic built their own called Nexus, and then Oracle's got one now, and MedAllies is one, and Conza is one. Apologies for any that I'm leaving out. But these qualified health information networks have sort of very like bold obligations to the network. And they're almost like the Verizon and the AT&T and the Sprint of this nationwide network. And when I say it's federated, what I mean is the data is everywhere, right? So data is in electronic health records, data is in payer systems. And we're not pumping it all into one big server that sits in a mountain in Colorado or something like that. These are federated databases, and TEFCA and the QHINs, these, maybe 8 now health information networks, allow us to onboard to them to query for Brendan Keeler's data. Maybe Brendan has an appointment tomorrow and an EHR can say, I want to know more about Brendan before he comes in. Or maybe Brendan himself is saying, oh, it's my data and I want it now, like JG Wentworth. And he goes to do what's called an IAS, Individual Access Services Query, to the network. Tons and tons of nodes, that are helping you on-ramp into this network of QHINs. So think of it more like a phone book or a spider web than a big database. But TEFCA has been around for years now. It's been live for years now. Adoption is, I would say, lukewarm. It's not mandatory for any reason, right, Brendan? It's completely voluntary to join. There's no incentive structure that's bringing entities except for added usability for their users.
Well,
right?
There was the TEFCA exception within information blocking, which is an interesting route for the last administration to push it forward. With HTI 5 proposed rules, it looks like that will be ripped out. I want to push on what you're saying. What is your measure for lukewarm?
That's a good question. Good questions.
More than 500 million records.
I would say if you're familiar with Carequality or Commonwealth or eHealth Exchange, which have been the nationwide networks that are around longer, those are still being used to exchange CDA documents, clinical document architecture standard documents, which are generally patient summaries or discharge summaries, things like that. Those networks are being used to exchange a much higher volume of documents for the purpose of generally transitions of care. All of these networks pretty much only allow treatment use cases, like you have to be a provider querying other providers to get data. TEFCA has recently introduced that individual access service use case that I talked about. And they all have trouble introducing other use cases because it's hard to trust, thousands of nodes on a network that you don't actually have business agreements with. And so I guess TEFCA has seen a lot of adoption in that Athena's on TEFCA, Epic sites are on TEFCA, if not completely. They're trying to roll out to make sure their endpoints are available. Who else is already on there?
Has been Meditech, Athena, ECW, Epic are all on there. Oracle has like a few sites, right? Because they came a QHIN later of the 11 QHINs that are participating. And so, yeah, I think lukewarm, the measure metric, like there's always like, what's our bar for success is the way I think about it. And relative to Carequality, it's like, wow, look, the numbers, it just doesn't match up. But exchange is in a decentralized network is exponential because
in growth.
In terms of growth, because the number of connections goes up exponentially with each new participant, or, in terms of linking between them all. And so I think it's like, okay, is that successful? Well, like by treatment, if you're measuring against Carequality, it's like, well, it's not even close. But should we be, or should we be looking at it as a net new network because it's facilitating individual access services, which was zero before? And so by that measure, you might say, wow, what a stunning success, because it's doing something at scale with some problems that we can talk about. But so the measure and metric, I think I'm putting it relative to where it was 2 years ago, which was zero.
Right. Well, and it's funny, we had the same conversation just on the last podcast towards the end. It said something about the CMS health tech ecosystem and is it going to be successful and how much work are they getting done? And Brendan was like, they've gotten so much work done considering it's only been 9 months. So that's a good point, Brendan. If I was building an electronic health record and I wanted to connect to a nationwide network to pull charts, TEFCA might not be my first, might not be the first entity that I connect to. But even the fact that it's going to exist and hopefully supersede Carequality in use and in use cases is a great success. I guess I'm just saying it's not quite like, the king of electronic health data exchange. And particularly, I guess, something that sours how I feel about it is that I have a terrible individual access service experience every time I use TEFCA. Varies a little bit per implementer. There's, from an IaaS provider perspective, there are these different companies that have built mechanisms for you to authenticate that you are yourself, usually using like a Clear or an ID.me, which is IAL2 level authentication. It's saying, I'm looking at your face and I'm looking at a government issued ID, and I say, this must be Pryce. And then you can send a query to your QHIN that says, go look for Pryce's charts. But man, I've got an Athena based doctor down the road that doesn't respond to my IAS queries, when I go to the network and say, I need my charts for, for my Aura app. Like I want it to be tied to my sleep score and things like that. I never see the North San Antonio Healthcare Associates. And I don't know if that's FlexPa's fault. Just that's an example of an IAS implementer. I don't know if it's their QHIN's fault. I don't know if it's Athena's fault. I don't know if it's my site on Athena's fault. Like if it's my particular provider who said like, our council doesn't like the idea of that. Don't turn it on for us. And so, yeah, it's hard. Again, like as far as success goes, I've never built a trusted exchange framework and common agreement. So props to the folks who have done it. But it's been disappointing so far for me, and I'm like wanting to know how to push the ball forward.
Yeah, Brad, what about you? You tried it out?
Well, as I think all the listeners should know, whenever there is a new opportunity to test one of these, I think I'm one of Brendan's trusted exchange dummies.
Guinea pigs, if you will.
Yeah,
You're my guinea pig.
The weird part about this for me is my healthcare for the past, let's call it nearly a decade, has been at two health systems, the random third one in there that we don't need to talk about. So the request pattern for me is like pretty straightforward. And if I use somebody, if I test somebody who's also using G10 APIs, then I can just log into my Epic MyChart and like I get everything. Honestly, this isn't really a critique of the network, but if I had to critique one part about my experience, is my problem list or my conditions just never gets cleaned up. And so for somebody, I'm not living with any, aside from being morbidly obese in every sort of after visit summary, I'm not, yeah, it says I have a torn calf that happened 6 years ago. And like, why has nobody taken that off? I don't need IAS to like really change anything about my life, but it is frustrating as a patient to suddenly be able to see everything and feel like it almost makes me feel like I have less agency, which I know is that's like a tangent that we don't necessarily need to go down. I have lived in the same city. I have gotten the same care from the same set of providers for a really long time. I hear stats about people not moving more than 2 zip codes away from where they were born, or like not a super mobile population. I sometimes come back to like, how big is the problem that we're solving? Or can we define specific use cases that house an actual documentation or transparency problem instead of saying, can we get 7 billion records exchanged across TEFCA?
If you look at other network-based problem sets like payments, there are ubiquitous networks like cash, right? Cash is a ubiquitous network in terms of being able to go and bring it to most places historically and use it. And even with the advent of check and credit card and other technologies, cash still prevailed because of ubiquity, flexibility, etc. And so as we think about Carequality, like will it be sunset or something? Well, there's ubiquity to it, so maybe it persists. As we think about prior patient access networks, you hinted at one, Brad, that I think we should illustrate further, is that individual access services is the fifth generation of us attempting to give patients access to their data. And so it started with HIPAA in terms of the patient right of access, a very manual but ubiquitous process that I can go statutorily with a statutory right and request my information from any hospital. It is ubiquitous. It applies to all covered entities.
But that was like a right, not a process.
But it establishes a ubiquitous sans HIPAA and that right. You go to your hospital, they're like, hey, get the hell out of here. And so it's not ubiquitous. So it built a ubiquitous, albeit manual network like cash. And so it's persistent. It's still the fallback. We then had view, download, transmit, which for all certified EHRs, they needed to give a capability in the patient portal to download a CDA document. And so not as ubiquitous, but pretty far along the pattern in terms of certified EHRs are many, many different providers. And as a result, scrapers built, Human API and other scrapers built the capabilities to reach in there and built a network, right? A network to allow for programmatic access to those CDA documents. Pryce, your hand was up, so you got a thought, I think.
I just wanted to clarify, I think view, download, transmit was like meaningful use or something. What era are we talking about? Like 2015 or something? Okay. And then the output, just to be clear to the layperson, I mean, even myself, because I'm not an engineer, a CDA is like an XML formatted, blurb of confusing information to the layperson. And so it was available programmatically, but maybe not immediately usable unless you were using one of these aggregators like One Record who could figure out how to make it useful for you.
The hypothetical benefit was that CDAs also were both computable formats and also with a renderer, could be rendered visually. Like that was one of their benefits and like why people liked that format. And so hypothetically, it was beneficial in that way. The bigger barriers were typing in your username and password to individual patient portals. And
which is authentication. That's proving that you are who you're saying you are. If I say I'm Pryce and I know Pryce's username and I know Pryce's password, then the system just has to assume that I am Pryce.
Yep. And so that persisted. We assumed that the problem with that generation, the CDA and view, download, transmit generation of patient access was the format, that it wasn't programmatic enough, that it wasn't an API. And so with Meaningful Use 3, but really the Cures Act, we said, okay, certified EHRs need to make available APIs with core clinical data that can be surfaced to third-party applications. So we assumed from a regulatory and policy perspective that would fix it. That was the big problem. And then people aggregated those APIs, notably OneUp Health, notably DUL, notably One Record, were some of the big people that pushed that. Yep. And we encountered another problem. What's that problem? Username and password for Brad is not challenging. But for some populations, if you have chronic illnesses, if you've moved around a lot, you might have a lot of portals. You may not have activated those portals with username and password.
The activation, I know you did. There's a great piece if you want to know how psychotic Brendan is of him signing up for every MyChart. And the one health system that is not in New York City that I have records at has this like insane, you have to get a PIN code, and they mailed me a postcard and I didn't get that postcard fast enough I was like, why am I going through a 3-month process to create a username and password for a health chart that like I don't care about? And I will say I can now get access to those records. So that's positive. Thank you, TEFCA.
What is security if not a 3-month friction-filled process? The bad guys can't get in.
No. You better have the key to my mailbox. You better. It was wild.
But yeah, that was the barrier perceived by our regulators, right? Kristen Valdez of BeWell has termed it portalitis, right? For these frequent flyer, chronic illness, or sickos like myself that go and sign up for all the portals. But
That is a
but
different
whatever
form of
means,
chronic illness.
you've gotten so many portals, it takes a lot of time to log into the 57 portals. Literally takes me half an hour. And so the TEFCA individual access services supersedes a fairly ubiquitous capability, the Cures Act G10 APIs, with less friction-filled experience where you take the clear ID.me or persona, ID proofing, selfie and such, and then can hypothetically pull from the network. The problem being it's not at the same ubiquity. And so I think of it like Apple Pay or Google Pay, where you're like, sweet, I can use that sometimes, but I can't use it all the time. And so we still fall back to check. We still fall back to ACH. We still fall back to cash when we want to get ubiquity.
Quick question for you guys. So I get excited about new capabilities and diagnostic imaging. One part about getting my records when I had a weird illness, I had to take a CD into NYU for them to put my imaging and then mail that off to somebody else, which was like, I mean, I figured out how to do it, but like, had I not had time to take off work, those images would have never gotten out of NYU. Is ONC, and maybe we don't know the answer, but when ONC considers new data types to be exchanged, is TEFCA the default network that they're going to use, or will we establish different network?
I think it remains to be seen, right? I mean, like, so the CMS put out an RFI for diagnostic imaging this
It was
year.
the ONC.
It was the
Actually,
ONC? Okay. Did they say we should do this on TEFCA? No. And if they were to try to do that, it would probably require a lot of new technology because right now TEFCA is largely CD and XCPD still, which is HL7 version 3, FHIR sort of HL7 version 4.
The history here, there's a couple commingled factors that make it challenging. So diagnostic images aren't in the EHR typically, right? They're in the PAC system, which is unregulated. So that's challenge one, is like, how do you get Sectra and AGFA and all these other PACs to build the capabilities and start to play in the ecosystem when they're not regulated? That's challenge one. Challenge two is these are big files, terabytes potentially, depending on the type of diagnostic image that's produced, let alone video for like endoscopies and such. Three is, like, what are we doing matters, like, because just surfacing in the USCDI data set says this is a core piece of clinical data. And then it's like, are we doing patient access to that data? Are we doing B2B networked exchange? Are we just making it available for point solutions? Like, there's different problem sets to be solved. And so the RFI was inclusive. It was sort of like poking around at all of them. It was like, all right, how would we do it for provider to provider? How would we do it for patient access? The nice thing for patient access is that brilliant HL7 geniuses, particularly Josh Mandel, have already done like an implementation guide and planned out how you do it for that problem set. Like, what are the ways the EHR would interact with the PACs? For B2B, what's interesting is there's like 30 different standards. So like there's been many different cuts at WAD-ORS over DICOM or all these different obscure acronyms for like, how could you translate it or transmit it rather? And we don't have a consensus. There was even in Carequality and Commonwealth implementation guides for diagnostic image exchange. And they tried to engage different vendors like AGFA and Ambra and Life Image. And they were like, well, why would we do this? We want to do our proprietary private networks for diagnostic image exchange. And so it's challenging. It's challenging for all those reasons, but international precedent shows it's possible. So the Netherlands does diagnostic image exchange. They use what's called XDS-I. So basically an extension of the technologies used for Carequality and CDA exchange. And they do it. Not ubiquitously in regional health information exchanges. They have what's called TWIIN, which is a national initiative, and they're making tremendous progress there. So just about picking it, incentivizing it, and getting people to play along.
It does matter what the use is here. Like we think, okay, so why are images not flying across this network as well? And then my first thought is kind of like, well, generally the moment an image is taken, it's diagnostic imaging. Then a radiologist who is affiliated with where the image was taken interprets the image and writes all about it, and then it's back in the EHR. So in a lot of ways, you could say like, well, the value of the image has already been extracted, and somebody should have access to that information via CDA exchange or FHIR APIs, things like that. Of course, I guess it makes sense that a lot of physicians or radiologists or whomever would say, well, I would actually like to see the image myself as well and come to my own conclusions. Is that what's happening here? Is that why people are always like, I want the image instead of just the diagnostic study, which is sort of the outcome of what we thought of the image?
Brad, you look like you have a thought.
I would guess that this is a trust issue and like whether or not I think somebody read the diagnostic study correctly. My opinion is slightly tinged by like has the ability to get those records between systems, the diagnostic studies improved over the last 5 years when I had to deliver a CD to the hospital, or
Well, you're saying like, would it be
like
more
has it
likely
changed?
nowadays? Yeah. Would it be more
Yeah.
likely nowadays that the doctor to whom you're going next is like, well, I already get the gist of what what that MRI said, or yeah.
There's
But
just a lot of workflows where it's valuable.
Yeah.
A second opinion is just an obvious one where it's like, I think this radiologist is shit. Let me go down the street and suddenly
yeah.
you gotta go get another MRI or something. That stinks. It could be like you get injured again, right? You break your leg again, and they're like, okay, well, let's go see what the break originally was last time. And
Mm,
looking at the radiologist report might not give the information to the new radiologist of like, okay, what happened here? How did it heal? Like there, and then there's value to these diagnostic images, right? If you could build a big data set, you could start to do nifty things about, with AI radiologists and things like that. So there's a variety of reasons that, yes, the diagnostic reports that are produced from these images are transmitted or should be transmitted at least, but still there's voracious demand to understand and see the actual raw images for reinterpretation or different reasons.
so to build on this, we're saying we have TEFCA. TEFCA is live. Trusted Exchange Framework has tens of thousands of hospitals on it, and you can send a query up to a QHIN that says, I'm looking for Pryce. He has an appointment with me tomorrow. And then like queries go out to all the other QHINs that try to locate me based on my demographics and my identity, not based on some sort of universal identifier, and then
Not
notify.
yet.
Not yet, not until I get my Imperial chain code Star Wars reference.
It's a good weekend for that. It's a good weekend
Great
for that.
weekend. Just saw The Mandalorian and Grogu last night. But first, really, TEFCA was like, okay, covered entities are going to exchange data with covered entities, and they will authenticate against each other. Like you will know that it is Hopkins making the query when Hopkins makes the query, and then the authorization. The next step, authentication, is do I know the server making the query? Authentication or authorization. The second auth Z there is like, do they have permission to access this data? I believe they are who they say they are, and now what data do they have access to permission? Or permission to access. And by and large, providers should have access to clinical data when they're treating someone, and the whole chart, except for maybe behavioral health information, would be exchanged so long as patients opted in and things like that. But we're talking about how using the same framework for multiple use cases can be challenging. How do you implement this if it's a slightly different use case? And so with individual access services, we see an interesting debate happening. I guess I'm not sure the history of this debate in TEFCA, but I can tell you it's certainly happening, or people are thinking about it a lot with regards to the CMS health tech ecosystem and CMS aligned networks. When we do individual access services, like I said, I might take an app that's going to help me query TEFCA for my records, and it will use Clear to verify that I am who I say that I am. And it'll go off and query the networks, the QHINs, and say, it's for sure Pryce looking at his phone. He wants to give his data to Aura because he is an Aura user and he wants to allow them access to his charts at his Athena PCP. The question then is, okay, I've authenticated that I am who I say I am. Typically, I would then need to authorize some sort of release of data from the system that actually has it. So just as an example, when you go to sign in to Instagram, and then it says, do you want to sign in using Google? And you click yes. Then it takes you to Google, and Google says, do you want Instagram to have access to your name, your birthday, your email, etc.? And you say yes. And that is you authorizing. You've authenticated that you are who you say you are, and you authorize the exchange of data for a certain time period or for a certain scope of information. And right now, that's not exactly happening with TEFCA. The authentication is saying, okay, this is definitely Pryce, return his chart. And only Epic, I think, is at the moment on TEFCA, then redirecting. And this is pissing a lot of people off because they think it's Epic sort of blocking the liquidity of data. But Epic then
There's
says,
literally, let's be clear, there's literally an antitrust lawsuit by the AADJ against them for alleging that. So yeah,
well,
I would say some people think it.
it's for a lot of things. Yeah, I could go on about that for a minute too. So yeah, it's just like, is, is Epic right or wrong by saying, well, okay, I believe that it's Pryce on the line. Now I want him to log in and tell me, here's your records from Hopkins, which uses Epic. How long do do you want us to give them your allergy, your meds? Do you want to give us all this? How long do you want them to have access to it? And so, in a way, Epic thinks that they're being pragmatic and usefully, I guess, limiting the unlimited exchange of healthcare data without my permission. But in a lot of ways, people are like, no, if Pryce took his picture and he asked to fetch his records, he wants the whole thing. And so authentication and authorization at the moment, they're hard to implement separately because people wanted them to be jammed together. But we're doing this on Rails, that didn't account for this kind of very nuanced piece of the workflow. So yeah, where have we landed with that, Brendan? Maybe you could tell us, like, is there an official recommendation from TEFCA or from the CMS health tech ecosystem as to how we're handling that for individual access services?
Yeah, a couple things I'll layer in. Epic alone is doing the FHIR-based flow, right? So when data is retrieved for individual access services, it's going through and doing this, what's called an XCPD first, right? Which is not FHIR. It's a patient search to all the QHINs. It says, hey, do you have Pryce? Do you have Brendan? Do you have Brad? Here's the identity token that they proves that they proofed with Clear, proofed with ID.me, proofed with Persona. And then those different QHINs say, yup, here's where they've been seen. So for me, it's like 50 Epic sites, one ECW site, some random HIE that I've never been seen at, which I don't know why is happening. And anyway, and then they go and they can do one of two things. They can either go and do a CDA retrieval if that's what's supported, or they can go and do the FHIR flow. And so for all the other individual access services implementations thus far that we're aware of, they just said, okay, well, if you include individual access in the header of your CDA retrieval, we'll give you back the CDA that we give for treatment. So it's a very blunt, old school approach, but probably more simplistic to implement than full new FHIR flows.
Well, and admittedly, 98, 99% of the people who are taking a picture of themselves on Clear to fetch their patient records probably just want the whole patient record to come back, right? They're not looking to then talk to Epic and say, yeah, it was me. Here are the pieces that I want. But go on.
Does the end user care? They care that the job to be done that they're doing is done.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
The way I think about it. Does the app care? Well, I think there's a lot of people out there that would say, well, we need to get to a new FHIR native network. And in that way, the only person pushing on that right now thus far is Epic. And so props to them. We have to give credit with the, what was it, shit sandwich, right? Like the positive, the negative, and the positive. So the ship part, the middle part is authentication and authorization. With the CDA flow, you're done. You've already identity proof. Great. You got authorization. You got authentication baked in. You pull those documents. Have fun. For the Epic flow, from a privacy perspective, from a security perspective, they're saying on behalf of their health systems, we need to have authentication, a layer of authentication, and then the authorization to prevent security breaches is the argument that's been posited. And until they can get government relief from the OIG saying, if we release this pattern, we're not going to be liable for a HIPAA breach, then they have been pushed saying, we don't want to do this because there's no upside. What is the upside to doing this except somebody suing us when a breach happens in this pattern? And make no mistake, people sue about these things all the time. And HIPAA doesn't afford the right of private action, but they find patterns and ways, right? We see this with the Health Gorilla Epic lawsuit where there's all these class actions that are brewing. And so there's a reality that people need to at least understand that is the math for, Cleveland Clinic's general counsel. So the ship is sailing there though, because the CMS health tech ecosystem, all these trends are saying we got to get rid of authentication. Optically, it's not looking good for Epic. So authentication is at least consolidating down to MyChart Central, right? One login for Epic, and probably looking to get rid of it at some point later this year or in the future. And so authentication goes away, but authorization is interesting because it's like, well, if I have authorization and it's on the health system side, then I can do nifty things like deal with caretakers or deal with other proxy situations so that Pryce, after he's identity proofed and starts to pull records, could then select and say, okay, I want it for my son or for my mother or some, a proxy situation. And so that could be accommodated slightly more in a slightly more straightforward fashion with hospital side authorization. But I also think the ship has sailed there where like people are like, well, we want authorization outside of the EHR, outside of the provider, which means that we have to go reinvent something to deal with proxies.
Also, really quickly, Epic actually does enable health systems to turn on either respond directly to the IAS query or ask for authorization from the patient by not only requiring the IAL2 OIDC token from Clear, but also get them to log in and say which part. Those health systems, those Epic using health systems can allow either path. And to your point, Brendan, all of their, regulatory compliance and legal officers are saying, make it as hard as possible to access this data unless it's Brendan, unless he remembers his password and his username, things like that. So it's interesting, like they can develop something, but they're not implementing it. It's these providers who are implementing it the way that they want to implement it. Brad, did you have something to say?
I was going to say for the lay listener, like we're talking about whether or not consumers want GDPR or cookie banners. Like, do you want to accept all? Do you want to go through? And experience-wise, I think as long as IAS is an accepted paradigm, most patients, based on other industries, most patients are just going to take the whole record if they can get it and not be discerning about it. This is a can of worms that I don't think we should open, but that leads to likely a lot of leakage of that health data. It's going to entities that are not covered by HIPAA. Equifax lost all of my information a long time ago, so I'm constantly locked down, but we're probably going to start having to go through a clear identity process for like billing purposes, because the chance for fraudulent billing with our health records is going to explode dramatically. This is just law of unintended consequences, which is a hard thing to open towards the end of our time that we can talk together. But I do think regardless of what businesses try to do, patients are going to look for the easiest solution. And the easiest solution is dump everything and let the vendor who's getting this data figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, and it's why, look, I think of everything in trade-offs. So it's like all these architectures we're talking
Legalize
about, we're all legalize, processize, technologize it. You think about the trade-offs of like, what does it mean to put authorization on the health system side? What does it mean to put it on the credential service provider like Clear? And what would it mean to put it on the app? And there's just trade-offs that are very clear about those architectures. And we have to consider, okay, what are we optimizing for? Like we would in a product management. It's like a product management for this national product, this national architecture, what are the trade-offs? And so the biggest trade-off with app-owned authorization is you no longer have separation of church and state, right? You have to control and constrain the behaviors of the app by legal terms, by saying, oh, you've certified the Karen Code of Conduct. Oh, you've been certified by this group. Oh, you've signed this thing. Whereas if another entity, Clear or ID.me, were to own authorization or the health system, then suddenly the vector for abuse is mitigated by separation of who is asserting something and who has certain prerogatives. It seems like we're choosing to move it to the app layer, and that's fine. We just need to be really, really honest with, there's going to be apps that have a different, there are good apps today, like Be Well or like FastSend, right? That are good and honest and think thoughtfully about how they're treating patients. There are less scrupulous apps that will come. And how do we constrain them from abusing it when their intention and their goals differ from the patient's? We can do it with legalese, we can do it with certifications, we can do it with all those behavioral things, but it removes the technological barriers towards abuse.
Well, it's Memorial Day weekend. We've told you a lot about TEFCA, but what's everybody putting on their burger this weekend?
Ooh, I think I still need to buy sausages and tortillas because that's how we roll down here in San Antonio. A little sausage wrap.
Dang, we got to get down there for a team trip. Okay. That's what's up.
Mm-hmm. Brendan?
I'm doing it Dutch style. I'm going to do mayonnaise on my burger. Just kidding.
Is that Dutch?
But anyway, no, just kidding. I'm not a sicko. I'm not a sociopath, at least in that facet of my life. But all right, well, have a great Memorial Day. If you're interested in working with this crew on TEFCA, on IAS, on all the good things, please reach out, and we'll talk to you all later.
See y'all.